This is David Trepp with BPM. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for our quarterly cybersecurity webinar this morning. Many of you recognize me from previous cybersecurity webinars. Today, I have the privilege of introducing a guest speaker. So today, as you can see on the slide here, Lynn, the partner in charge of BPM's IT security advisory team, is going to be talking to us about auditing in the cloud. And as many of you are aware, BPM has really three pillars of services: tax, assurance, and advisory. And while tax does not have a big cybersecurity practice, of course, assurance and advisory do. Typical perspective for a presentation that I perform as a member of the assurance team is about testing and assessment related activities. Today, Lynn is going to be speaking with us, and Sarah leads the advisory team. Today, we're going to look at security from an advisory perspective, and Sarah has a wealth of experience in this area. Her team does a lot of work to help prepare people for compliance with various standards, as well as regulations and statutes. They have a great security monitoring practice that runs 24/7, watching the security event and incident logs for your business. And Sarah herself has been doing this a long time, has, as you can see on the slide here, a great deal of the relevant experience. She's also a wonderful speaker. So we've got the pleasure today of having Sarah talk to us a little bit about cloud security issues. So Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, David. That was a great setup. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone to the 2020 cybersecurity series and auditing in the cloud. We really want to support everyone in talking about responsibilities. So next slide, please. Let's go right into it. So our agenda today will be to talk about or learn about who the cloud service provider is, whether that's the host or the cloud service provider, the SaaS company, or a cloud service customer and who they are to the host, or a cloud service customer and who they are to the SaaS products, and to demonstrate how it works, who's responsible, what happens when something doesn't work, like a corner case or maybe a mitigating control, as we like to call it, and how to review the CSP or the cloud service provider either before you buy the product or during your time of service, which is a responsibility we'll talk about. Next slide, please. So I thought that it would be good to have some quick definitions. My colleague David said, Sarah, stop using all those acronyms and get to the real point. So here's the real thing. Let's talk about the definitions. The cloud service provider, the host, that is likely a location where you have servers and network instead of at your company headquarters or office or your data center, but you can go on to the premises and touch those servers or those networks. And sometimes people call it on-prem because it's in your office or your headquarters, and sometimes they use the word on-prem by meaning that you can go touch them at the service server or network level. So we'll talk about some of those. There are plenty of data centers around that are hosts that may still be a provider. Then there's the SaaS products, a cloud service provider. Software like Adobe Online is a SaaS product where you actually go online to use the product or service or software in this case. But in fact, it's not resident down on your computer or in your office. You buy a subscription and your software stays in the cloud. And then there is PaaS, or platform as a service. And some people argue whether Microsoft Office 365 is software as a service or platform as a service. I like to look at it as platform as a service because it offers more than one software. Your email's in the cloud, your calendar's in the cloud, your applications in the cloud, the SharePoint's in the cloud, your storage is in the cloud, the encryption's in the cloud. The whole platform can be in the cloud, and You may have nothing resident on your local laptop. You may have no local servers. And there are hybrid solutions that have some of this, some of that. Then there is the IaaS, or the infrastructure as a service. And some companies like Rackspace, for example, if you have stuff in Rackspace, they offer that you can build your own thing, your own systems, your own network, your own applications, and run it in the CSP, and they'll run some of the pieces for you. They may operate for you. They may rack and stack for you. You may never go there. They might do a lot of things for you, and you have administrative control back in your office. And this runs into some pretty important things called shared responsibility. So pretty important things. And then the cloud service customer is likely you. Since you're buying cloud services or SaaS or PaaS or IaaS or hosts, you're likely to be the cloud service customer. Now, you could be a cloud service provider yourself if you're offering a SaaS or PaaS or IaaS service. And I know that some of you on this call are technology companies that do have your own service. So you're the provider to some of your customers, and they in turn are the cloud service customer to you. And you in turn might be the cloud service customer to someone else. Sounds complex? Let's get into it. Next slide, please. So some of the things that get shared, whether you're on the SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, or host, are things from these pillars. If you're talking about security or compliance, your whole program that you're managing from your company is going to be from you with your provider scooped in and in mind. There is sort of a concept that when you buy the service, the cloud service provider becomes responsible for everything. We'll go into that in just a moment. So the things that are in these pillars that might be on you or on your cloud service provider would be things like policy and the control matrix. Who controls what piece of the policy? You have your security policies, your IT policies, the provider has theirs. Where is the line on the responsibility matrix so that we know who is doing what? Pillar 2 are the procedures, the standards, the requirements, the configuration, and all the reporting. So there are procedures that either you perform into the cloud, and it could be something as simple as putting your files in some structure in Dropbox or Box or another file sharing system, SharePoint. It could be a procedure for file transfer between you and your customer that goes through a provider. These procedures are between you and the service provider. You likely both have a procedure and you want to make sure that they work together. You likely both have standards. Your company might be ISO standards, and the cloud service provider could be on cloud security standards or NIST standards. You want to put those together so that ultimately your customers get what they need or greater. No one's left in the dark. And then requirements and configurations. Of course, you have your requirements, and sometimes that's what you care about. Later on, you find out about configurations that were set that you didn't know about. So it's good to get those up front. You've heard about a few of these in the last year or two, where maybe someone bought a baseline AWS configuration and didn't know that they had to further secure it. They thought it was secure out of the box, or in this case, in the cloud, out of the cloud. But there are configurations that you're going to be responsible for and your provider is going to be responsible for. And then reports. Depends on what type of certification, attestation, authorization that you're up for. You have to provide reports. And those reports are not just from the cloud. They are from the cloud provider to you You approve what's there, you make changes, you tell the provider it's good enough, not good enough, and then there's a report from you. So it's more than a one-step reporting, it's a two-step process. You're approving that the cloud service provider does what you are expecting and does what you want them to do to keep up with your certification, attestation, authorization. Starting to get complex, isn't it? So then we go to pillar 3, the data, the privacy, the physical, the asset management, the inventory, the vendor security. Who's securing the data? What privacy components do we really care about that get secure? Who's securing the physical in the cloud? Obviously the provider is securing it, but you have some pieces down at the headquarters of the office that are physically need to be controlled by you as well. Assets, whether they're IPs or servers or networks or VPCs in the cloud, somebody labels them assets, somebody classifies them. Who's doing what? And then vendor security, what other components or vendors do you allow in your cloud? Who else touches it? Who else manipulates it with APIs? Who else manipulates the cloud with just an attachment or an interconnection to your cloud? All of this is called out in responsibility matrix between you and the cloud. Then we get to a really super overlooked pillar, which is security operations. Who's watching? Who's watching your cloud 24 hours a day? I call it eyes on glass. David's team does pen testing in this area. We do vulnerability scanning in this area. We also do event management in this area. Many of the providers do this for you, but you get the reports and you're responsible for saying it's okay or it's not okay. It meets your expectation. It meets your certification, attestation, authorization requirements or not. So this is an often overlooked area and something that we like to support our customers in. Even if we're not the people watching for you, we can help you support that the provider is doing what they're supposed to and you're getting what you need. And then finally, pillar 5 are reviews, assessments, and audits. And this is something my team supports reviews and the forward-looking, almost like an internal audit, repetitive life cycle. David's team actually supports the assessments and the audits that come later so that you stay in certification, attestation, authorization mode. All that said, this sits on top of your back-end policies, standards, and guidelines at the company, your logging and management policies, procedures, certifications that you already hold, your ability to monitor, log, remediate, hold BCP and DR tests, manage incidents, manage backups, or ensure that the provider is doing it for you. So I know I spent a lot of time on this slide, but this is just the beginning of the conversation. So this is just the basic responsibilities, making sure that we understand what team, what group, what company owns each control that's required if you're in that certification, attestation, authorization mode, or if you're somebody who's just compliant with one of like ISO, NIST, FedRAMP, high trust, etc. You want to know who owns the control or if you're sharing the control. And who you should talk to in order to see that the strength of the control is set as you expect it to be. And when the control is not met, who's correcting it? Are we correcting it? Or do I have to call my service provider and have it correct? Do I open a ticket? What's my expectation for getting it corrected? So these are some basic cloud responsibilities. Now I know after the last 2 slides, now you're thinking this is all complex, and this is where we want to help you demystify it. So next slide, please. So here's the big myth. If my company deploys our products and services to another host, a platform, AWS, Rackspace, whoever, we're no longer responsible if it's breached or not secure. And that's not true. So let that sink in just a minute, that you've done your due diligence when choosing a cloud provider. You do your reviews that the cloud provider still is secure, that they're being audited, that you know what their findings are, you know what they're doing on your behalf under contract, and that you are reviewing them on a regular basis. There's no such thing as passing the buck in this area to your cloud service provider. So indeed, about 1/3 of your responsibilities goes away by using the cloud service provider and having an airtight contract and doing your reviews of them, ensuring they are doing what they are supposed to do in support of you. But your responsibility is never zero, never less than 50%. It's only about 1/3 handed to the cloud service provider. If you can't get an ROI that doesn't work for you there, you're not choosing the right provider yet. So we can help. Anyway, let's move on. Next slide, please. So this is a cloud matrix visual that I downloaded from AWS. If you use AWS, and I'm sure some of you do, you have either storage there, or you have your application there, or multiple applications, or you're building your product in AWS. The things that AWS themselves is responsible for at the very bottom are the regions and availability zones. That's all fluffy talk for BCPDR. So we got an East Coast site and a West Coast site, and if East Coast goes down, West Coast picks up. And our customers never see a drop service under BCP, or we have it under DR, where we pay for when one site goes down, the other picks up 4 hours later, whichever way you've contracted it to do. You want to be really aware. You don't want to be in a situation where you've chosen DR but think that it's BCP and your customers think it's BCP. Non-technical terms, if a disaster occurs, did you contract for your disaster recovery site to come up within a certain period of time? Or did you contract for BCP, which is continuous service never goes down? It is important to know which one you contracted for before you tell your customer what you have. So AWS is responsible for all those data centers in the regions and the availability zones and the edges. They're also responsible for compute, which is really the servers, or the way they bundle and package their servers and services together, providing you a compute network. They're responsible for the storage, the database, the networking. So they're providing it to you. Your contract will tell you whether they're responsible for scanning and patching it or not. So a lot of people think I put it in the cloud and now the scanning and the patching is all good and I'm good and I never have to patch anything again, and that's not true. There are still compute components, network components, database components that need patching, and it's probably still on you. So thinking about that when you're thinking about your services, whether that's AWS, Azure, Rackspace, whoever it is. So you notice that's the end of AWS's responsibility. Look at all the things you're still responsible for. Customer data, the transit of the data, turning on encryption in your services, on the transit, on the storage, any applications you choose to bring into the environment, anything that you want to add to the platform, all your access and identity management. AWS is not going to care whether David or I log in. They're going to only provide the vehicle to get there. You still have to manage who has access and how that access management is granted in a secure way. All the operating system, the network and the firewall configuration. So you say, oh, Sarah, look down there. You said the compute and the network, that was provided by AWS. Yes, the shell of it is. It's absolutely provided. But if you need an upgrade to your OS, your operating system, you need a firewall configuration change, that's on you, still on you in the AWS world. Now, remember I said there was a different type of IaaS and the infrastructure as a service, Rackspace, for example. They might do these hands-on pieces for you by your rules, by your configurations, but it must be in the contract. So things to think about, things to manage, things to discuss before choosing a provider. And then if you look at the last little line here, the client-side data encryption, data integrity, that means that the data encryption between you and your client, not you and AWS or you and the host, but the encryption between you and your client, still your responsibility, still yours. The server-side encryption, whatever encryption you choose, whether it's AES 256 or something else, you have to choose the encryption that has to work for you and your customers and your applications. Your file systems have to be able to handle your encryption. And it, of course, has to meet your certification attestation authorization. And the networking traffic protection, encryption of the traffic in your application or in your file transfer, that's all up to you. You get to choose. It's not in the basic service. There are options. Some of them cost, but it's not automatic. So I think this is a really good slide to have. I think David mentioned at the end of this, we'll make sure you get a copy. This is a good visual when choosing, no matter whether it's AWS or someone else, to check box, is this handled by me or them? And if it's handled by them, how do I review it and ensure that they're doing it? One key area to look at, whoever your cloud service provider is, even if it's Box or Dropbox or AWS or Rackspace or Azure or IBM Cloud, whoever you're choosing, is they should have a cloud service provider responsibility matrix or statement on their website. Even Salesforce platform has this. What they are responsible for. Now, this is very, very high level. This is super high level. So you can actually ask for a cloud security matrix, and your cloud security provider will send you likely an Excel spreadsheet. This is me, this is you, this is you, this is me. And then you can see if you like the way this is going to go before you choose, or you can see if you can buy one of those pieces to move over into them column, but there's always going to be the you reviewing that they did it right for you in your certification attestation authorization. We're going to you have to make sure they did it as designed. And so there's a little blurb about the customer responsibility as well. And then when you're in the middle of your audit, so look at the right side of this slide, you're in the middle of the right side of the audit, you have all rights to ask for their reports, their certifications, their authorizations, their attestations. You have all rights to ask for those things. And then as a system owner, you should be able to review all of those reports that they have and all the controls and the matrix to make sure they're doing what you want them to do, and make sure that the owners, the provider or you, are doing exactly what you need them to be doing. Okay, so there are some things called shared controls. So in some providers, and I'll say IBM Cloud is one, IBM SoftLayer, which is becoming part of the IBM Cloud, Rackspace is another. There are items that the provider will do for you to a certain degree, and then open a ticket and hand it right back to you to complete. Or there are pieces that you can do, like set up new identities, and then open a ticket and have the provider complete. These are called shared controls or shared responsibilities. They often show up in patch management, configuration management, training, and even ticketing, identity management, where each, whether it's the provider or the customer, has a part of that control that they have to do. And if you're working in those big audits and the certifications, attestations, authorizations, you have to document who has which responsibility. So always good to know, always good to be prepared, especially if a piece falls back on you. And configuration management, patch management are biggies. Identity management, big, because a lot of people go into a cloud thinking that all of that is operated by the cloud service provider, and it's probably not. So pretty good. And then awareness training still on you. You have to teach your people how to follow the policies, procedures with the provider and follow your policies and procedures. So that's still on you. Yes, AWS trains their people, but that will not provide you what you need for your certification, attestation, or authorization. You can get that part of the shared control information from the cloud service provider, though. Just takes a little effort on your part. So the next few slides, I'm just going to give you some examples from a NIST control workbook. And then if you're an IT manager, IT security manager, you're a COO that does operating in the IT control areas, you will recognize this is a workbook on the left. And each one of these control areas or families or domains exist in your certification, attestation, or authorization with a control framework underneath. And the one I'm choosing to show you just happens to be NIST. And NIST controls are managed through AWS very nicely. And you would have a workbook or shared workbook that you would put together based on their control matrix that shows something like this family happens to be the physical and environmental controls. And I'm not going to go through the whole section because there's about 18 to 20 controls in this area. But as you see, the control statement of who develops the policy, who provides the protection policy for physical, environmental, who provides the procedures on how that is handled, you'll see that we are inheriting under the assessor response this particular control from AWS. We're going to let AWS have the control of our physical, environmental, all our air conditioning and generators and UPSs and those types of things. We're going to let them have control. However, we have to make sure they're doing it by getting their report and making sure they don't have a finding that indeed they don't have a generator. Or indeed they had 8 UPS outages this year that you didn't know about that maybe you should reap some reward for. It's our responsibility to still review even though the control is inherited and handed to the service provider. And if there are findings with the provider, it's our responsibility to follow up until they're closed. Or we choose another provider, which is sometimes harder to do later. Okay, next slide, please. So there's several PE controls, and these are all about physical and environmental. I'm not going to go through these, but you see on the right-hand side, because the sample we chose was AWS, they are inherited. We are letting AWS manage them, and we are receiving the reports and reviewing the reports and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to. Next slide, please. More PE controls. For those of you that are IT, security, IT, you are going to appreciate these, and you've probably seen them in some other format. So this slide deck may help you. You may send me an email and say, Sarah, I'd love to see the whole workbook. Where'd you get it from? And I can share that too. Next slide, please. Okay, so these same controls show up in ISO 27001 or 002 controls, 001 compliance. They're just a little bit different. They show up in the physical environmental security section 11, but these are the same controls. We're going to give AWS control of our physical and our environmental security, but we're still asking for the reports. We're still reviewing their audits. We're still making sure they don't have findings. We're still following up if they do. Next slide, please. More of the environmental controls. Those of you who want to see them, you can take a look. Next slide, please. Okay, and then you will see that Rackspace has very similar information about their controls. They have similar responsibilities in their information that they give you. But again, we're going to give them some permissions, or in our contract, we have contracted for something to be done. We still have to follow up with their certifications, attestations, authorizations, and we still have to do a review that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. This is generally a theme I think you've heard me talking about for 10 or 20 minutes now, but this is in general something that people don't think to keep in their practice in the very beginning until they go for you rather go for your own certifications, attestations, authorizations, and realize that you have to review your cloud service provider. So I'm just bringing it to your attention before you get to that mark. Hopefully you haven't gotten there already, but if you have, we can help. Okay, next slide, please. Just more of what's covered under Rackspace if you're dealing with them, and you see what's inherited through their controls. Next slide, please. Same thing. This is with the IA family and RA family and SI family. There are some pieces with some of those infrastructure as a service companies like Rackspace where they are actually hosting the SIM tool and the SOC, and so their IA or audit pieces are covered in or inherited. Again, we have to make sure that they're doing it. Some pieces of the risk assessment can be covered by them, and we make sure they're doing it. And then some types of protection like spam protection mechanisms can be covered by them. Let's just make sure they're doing it. The other thing that has to really be identified when you're trying to decide who owns the audit control, who's responsible, is the access control owners, who owns the actual identity management between you or the provider, who owns the deployment of multi-factor authentication, who owns the VPN, who's going to own the awareness training controls that have to be put in place between you and the provider if there are awareness training that needs to be done, whether that's your operations team or you have account managers. There are probably some components in the awareness and training controls that have to be worked out with your provider. It is your responsibility as the cloud service customer to ensure that all these controls are put in place with the provider, reviews are done, and that people are following them. And then in the AU family, the audit and accountability family, there are pieces that your provider may or may not do on your behalf. Again, look at your contract, look at your purchasing, look at what you already did purchase. Did you buy vulnerability scanning? Did you buy pen testing? And is it going down to the application level that you want it to, or is it sitting at the infrastructure AWS layer only and never going down your path of your application? You may or may not know the answer to that today, but David and I both can help in this situation, even if it's just a conversation, and looking at some of the reports that you may or may not get today and determining who's doing the scanning, who's doing the remediation, who's doing your pen testing. And the worst scenario would be to say no one. And so we would want to help you with that, or at least have a conversation if you wanted to before that became a concern. And then there are extra rules surrounding authorization, especially if you're, authorizing additional assessments or vendors from outside the normal customer service, a cloud service customer and cloud service provider. Maybe you're authorizing a third-party pen test from David's organization or another pen tester's organization. You want to make sure that you have tight controls on the assessments that are being done and the authorizations. Likely, your provider is not going to do them for you unless you've paid an additional fee. Likely not going to do that for you. Just let that sink in for a second. Okay, next slide, please. There are some other things as a cloud service customer that you should be aware of. The configuration management, whether you're using Linux or Windows boxes, which OS, which version, all of that is still under your control unless you're buying a very tight infrastructure as a service package or a very tight bundle from AWS. All of that is still under your say-so and likely required for you to patch unless you purchased patch management from your IaaS provider. This is an area that people get lost in a little bit, so happy to help. Contingency planning, that's that BCP-DR assurance. You're still responsible for the testing. You're still responsible for the documenting for yourself and your customers. The cloud service provider may provide you some information that you put inside of your DR, BCP, CP documents, but the document belongs to you. So it's important when you're going for certifications, attestations, authorizations to understand that and to get that delineated and into your plan. In the IA family, you want to make sure that all your tools are authorized tools, depending on who you are and what you're up to. Some of your customers may require you to have NIST 140-2 validations for some of your authentication tools. And so some of you may be sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, Sarah, all the acronyms, all the numbers, all the things. And some of you are used to this conversation, but we can certainly help because this happens for our customer, mine and David's customers all the time. And even the advice on whether the tools they're using are adequate for the cloud service provider or for the certification they're up to. And then incident response. Incident response, things happen with the provider. Things happen at your office. Things happen with your remote workers. You're still responsible for incident response at your headquarters with your remote workers, with your privilege users into the provider, and you're responsible for getting the information from the cloud service provider and document it as an incident that you're tracking for the provider. So if they have an outage, they have an incident, they have a breach, it's still important for you to document it, and you're still responsible for having that information, especially if you're in the line for certifications, attestations, authorization. In the area of maintenance, there's a lot of good news here. The maintenance contracts are usually covered by the cloud service provider. But again, you want to cover that in your contract, make sure that you're not paying extra for it, make sure it's on a schedule. And in ISO language, it actually says that the cloud service provider does maintenance in a way that does not disrupt your business. So this is all good news for you. You should have that in your contract, that the cloud service provider doesn't disrupt your business doing maintenance. And that in fact, if they do, you probably have a little reward waiting for you. Media protection, ensuring that all the media is protected. You have your media to protect. The cloud service provider has their media to protect. So what we're talking about here is media protection. So do we allow USB drives in our IaaS to be plugged in to an infrastructure, in our host to be plugged into an infrastructure? Do we allow that? Yes or no, depending on which certification you're going for. You may not allow USBs to be plugged in even to your laptops back in your headquarters. So all to be considered, these things may have two different control statements for one particular control. And you're always good to go to their audit and see what they say about media protection. Did their auditor say they were good and weren't plugging things in that you didn't want plugged in? Or did their auditor find a finding here? Planning and risk assessments, those are still on both of you. They have to plan, they have to assess. You have to plan, you have to assess. So this is important for you to know that you're responsible to a certain degree, that they do what they're supposed to do. Systems acquisition, this is making sure that the staging and the testing and the code review, if you have an application, get done either by you or in a way that you can control with your provider. Communications, sharing of data, making sure that the data and the communication stays secure. If you're using a ticketing system or you're using file transfer methods, they need to be secure methods. They can't just be any ticketing system or any file transfer methods. So next slide, please. I must be doing okay. Nobody said anything. All right, so let's move on. Just a few more minutes here. We have your own systems integrity, keeping the integrity of all your test data, keeping integrity of all your data. That's still on you. Your cloud service provider does not know about the integrity of your data. So if you're collecting data and you don't want it to be manipulated, the way you protect the integrity of your data is still on you. The provider is not providing systems integrity. And any program management that you do, security management you do, is still documented on your side. Your provider probably has some documentation as well, but many of you know that your program manager, security has to be considered in every project or every program that touches your provider. So important to know that you're doing it and they're doing it. Next slide, please. So we did get close to the end here. Here's some great references on some of the documentation that makes this a little more technical and a little more in depth. But I tell you, you know, we're happy to help you with providing you workbooks and letting you see how we plan some of this and, you know, give you some great advice in the future. And of course, it goes without saying that Dave and I provide advisory or audit and testing capabilities that we can do if that's something that you're in need of. Otherwise, you have these references. Next slide, please. All right, now we have come to the end of Sarah's monotonous talking, and let's go on to a little Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that was anything but monotonous. We have a good question here from Lorenzo Benzini. How often do you work with HIPAA requirements? So I'll let you answer that for your team, and then I'll answer that for my team.
Oh, absolutely. So we work with HIPAA requirements quite often, and sometimes they even get melded into high trust assessments or privacy assessments as those come together. So we've been working with a lot of customers on HIPAA, privacy, high trust for more than 12 years. Those who think that HIPAA just came into being a few years ago, it was, you know, a thought in Hillary Clinton's mind years ago. So it's been finding its way to our worlds along the way. So we've been working with it a very long time. And David, what about you?
Yes, on the testing side, HIPAA is a regulatory requirement that explicitly calls out technical and non-technical evaluations. So we work all the time with HIPAA-related organizations, from biotech to direct provider healthcare to the software providers who build healthcare software for testing purposes. So that's a core client industry for the assurance or the assessment team.
Mm.
Yeah, great question, Lorenzo.
Oh, thank you, Lorenzo. What else you have, David? Any other hot questions there?
No other questions in the Q&A. I have a question for you, though, Sarah.
Okay.
Maybe other people will think of other questions. You know, there's such a kind of a menagerie of cloud providers out there right now.
Right.
How would a small business that's, you know, building an infrastructure around the cloud, what are some best practices that the right vendor, whether it's looking at O365 versus G Suite or a infrastructure provider or whatever the case may be, what's some best practices you might advise people to take?
Well, that's a really good question. So first off, what are your customers asking you to secure? What kind of data do they have that they want you to secure? Are any of your customers asking you to be certified at all? So it's about you first, you and your customer. Then that makes the choice of what provider you should go to. And what I mean by that is if you and your customer decide that you want to be an ISO compliant certified company and you have your rules and you've worked very hard to get those in place, you certainly don't want to go put your data or your services in a provider that is also not ISO compliant or greater, because it downgrades a piece of what you've already been working on or plan to work on. So I always say, step one, what do your customers want? Step two, what are you up to? Step three, make sure the provider is the same or greater than you are. So that requires a little due diligence work. I created a form for our clients to use so that they can do a little due diligence and then they can come back and even ask more questions. But if that company that you're choosing is certified, that's step three. Now, step four, how much do you want them to be responsible for versus you being responsible for a little less or more and you doing reviews against that company at least annually? So how much do you want them to do? Can you break those components down in your mind of what you want them to do? Even if it's 20 questions, can you break that down? I want them to do this, but I don't want them to do that. I want them to do all of this. I don't have enough people. Do they really do that? These are important questions. And then the last one is, what did their customers say about them already? If their customers say that they're difficult to work with, difficult to get reports out of, that's a consideration that you would want to take. Just those 5 steps, David.
Super. Thank you for that. Well, then I think if there are no other questions from anyone in the audience, we'll wrap up. Thanks everybody for your time and attention. As you digest this material, if any other questions or comments come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sarah or myself. We're always happy to take questions.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, David.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.